All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Ronan O'Malley, and I'm the Senior Program Manager for the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. First of all, I want to thank you all so much for coming and welcome you all back, and hope you all had a wonderful holiday season. This is a great way to start off tonight, an excellent topic, a very timely topic, and a wonderful expert who's kindly spoken to the council before, so we're very happy to have Michael Doran back. Michael Doran is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., where he specializes in Middle East security issues. During the administration of President George W. Bush, Doran served as the White House Senior Director in the National Security Council. He was also served in the Bush administration as a senior advisor in the State Department and a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon. Doran is the author of Pan-Arabism Before Nasser, which analyzes the first Arab-Israeli war as an inter-Arab conflict. And he frequently appears on television and has published extensively in Foreign Affairs, The American Interest, Commentary, Mosaic Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. Doran's most recent and highly acclaimed book is Ike's Gamble, America's Rise to Dominance in the Middle East. And he's going to reference it as well, but it's an excellent book. I've just started it and thoroughly enjoyed it so far. It does an excellent job of kind of explaining what the United States after World War II, how we got to where we are now, and our presence and our models for action within the Middle East, and it lays an excellent groundwork for where we are today. I'd highly recommend the book. And we are selling the book, like I mentioned before, at the back of the room. So basically, if you would like to buy one, we will have one line for purchasing the book and one line for signing the books, because he's kindly going to sign his books afterwards. So please welcome me and please join me in welcoming Michael Doran back to the World Affairs Council of Houston. Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Thank you, Ronan, for that generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming and for having me here. I do have to take issue with one thing that Ronan said. He encouraged you all to buy a book. I encourage you to buy 4 or 5. You have friends. They're charities you should be donating to. Don't limit yourself to just one. I thought what I would do, I thought I would talk about the book. Ronan's given me only 3 hours, so I'm going to have to keep my remarks brief. I'll talk about the book, and then the book is actually, I didn't intend it to be this, but by the time I finished it, it turned into an allegory for the Obama administration. But I didn't connect up the dots in the book itself. I thought that the history had a kind of integrity to it, and I didn't want to yoke it to a contemporary analysis and then make it seem like I was writing a political tract. But in this venue, I'll go ahead and explain what I think is the contemporary relevance, and then maybe I'll switch topics a little bit and just make a few comments about where I think the Trump administration is going to go on the Middle East, and then we can open up to questions and talk about whatever's on your mind. So let me start with the book, and the title of the book is Ike's Gamble, and maybe I'll just start by explaining what the gamble was. When Eisenhower came in, he made a decision to tack away from America's traditional allies in the Middle East, the British, French, and Israelis, and to reach out to Arab nationalism personified by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt. And for about 6 years, he made this effort to tack away from the traditional allies. And then, according to me, he switched course and changed his mind about what he was doing. So what the book does is it tells the story of the learning curve of a very savvy and experienced president in foreign affairs. I mean, maybe the most experienced president in foreign affairs we've ever had, at least one of them. So when Eisenhower comes into power in January of 1953, Britain is still the dominant power in the Middle East. Churchill is the prime minister. It's his last government. He remains prime minister until April of 1955. Churchill is old. He's past his prime. And the British Empire is in a bad state. All across the Middle East, there are rebellions and breaking out against the British, and nationalism is on the rise. It's particularly acute in Egypt, where there are 80,000 British troops along the Suez Canal, what is euphemistically called the Suez base. It was actually a series of bases all along the canal. They were surrounded, the British troops were there, but they were surrounded by the Egyptians who were harassing them with the guerrilla attacks. So this created an image in President Eisenhower's mind of the United States as caught in the middle. On one side we had the British, and on the other side we had the Arab nationalists, and the United States was caught in the middle, and it had to decide what to do. And the decision that the president made was to reach out to the nationalists. He saw them as the force of the future. He saw the British Empire as in irreversible decline. And the key strategic issue for the United States was, of course, the oil of the Middle East. The fear in the White House was that extremist nationalists were going to align with the Soviet Union and cut off the flow of oil to Europe. The United States didn't need Middle Eastern oil at that stage, but the Europeans did. And European reconstruction was the #1 priority of the United States in the Cold War. We wanted to get Europe up and on its feet so it could balance the Soviet Union on its own, or at least do a bigger job of balancing the Soviet Union. And 100% of European oil came from the Middle East. 66% of it came from the Persian Gulf and went through the Suez Canal. The other 33% went across pipelines from the Persian Gulf over to the Mediterranean through Syria. So now it wasn't just the issue of the decline of Britain and the rise of nationalism that gave this image to Eisenhower of the Arab nationalists on one side and the British on the other. It was also the position of France in the world. The French were in trouble in Algeria. They were also in trouble in Vietnam, and so that created the sense that there was a problem for the United States throughout the developing world. It was caught between the rise of nationalism, of anti-colonialism, and the traditional colonial powers. But it was also the position of Israel in the Arab world that reinforced this vision that the Americans had. The administration, both in terms of political appointees and in terms of career bureaucrats in the State Department and the CIA, regarded the creation of Israel, or let's say the support for the creation of Israel by the Truman administration, as one of the worst strategic blunders in the history of American foreign policy. Perhaps the greatest blunder. It's impossible to exaggerate how much they thought this was a mistake. Because the idea that they had, just as in the case of the British, was that we were supporting an entity that was anathema to Arab nationalists, whom we needed in the Cold War. And so our association with Israel was driving the Arabs into the arms of the Soviet Union. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles goes to the Middle East. He's the first Secretary of State, sitting Secretary of State to visit the region in May of 1953, and he writes a memo to Eisenhower on the trip, and he says, the association in the minds of the people of the region, the association of the United States with European imperialism and Zionism is destroying our position in the Cold War. And he says that Israel and the European powers are millstones around our neck. So this picture that they had of the United States caught in the middle led them to believe that what they needed to do was distance themselves from the Europeans and the Israelis, both in the eyes of the leaders of the Arab world, but also the people. It had to be a public distancing. Everybody had to see that it was happening. We had to create the impression that there was a basis for cooperation between Arab nationalism and the United States, so as to win over the hearts and minds of the people of the region. Now, when they came into power, when Eisenhower came into power, he and his advisors regarded the Israel question as the most important one in the region. That they thought was the center of gravity of the whole in the whole area. But while it was the most important, it wasn't the most urgent. The most urgent problem were those 80,000 British troops in the Canal Zone. So Eisenhower set out from the moment he got in office to mediate between the British and the Egyptians. And this was especially important because Nasser in Egypt was regarded as the future of the Middle East. He was seen as a pragmatic leader, a pragmatic and pro-Western leader of precisely the kind that we needed in the region. He was promising the Americans that he wanted to lead not just Egypt, but all of the Arab countries into the side of the West in the Cold War. And he explained to the Americans that the presence of the British was making it impossible for him. It was creating a backlash that was making it impossible for him to align Egypt and therefore the Arabs with the West. And Eisenhower basically bought it. Now, I spent in the book 3 chapters telling the story of the conflict between Churchill and Eisenhower, which I was absolutely fascinated by. I got to tell you, as a writer, writing about Churchill is just irresistible because he's such a great character, but also he has left behind an enormous amount of documentation. I mean, his every thought, is documented mainly by him and documented extremely well. So if you want to tell the story of what he's up to, you have all this material to work with. The opposite is the same is not true of Eisenhower. Eisenhower is a very canny fellow. And the most interesting thoughts that Eisenhower has usually remain in his head. You may know that Eisenhower's definition of an intellectual is somebody who uses more words than he needs to tell you more than he knows. So I have to admit that I've, on occasion, my wife tells me I've been guilty of that myself. But in trying to convey to readers, what Eisenhower was thinking and doing, when you have a guy who has those kinds of attitudes, it's hard. But not with Churchill. Anyway, I spent 3 chapters telling the story of this conflict, which I'm gonna sum up for you in basically 1 sentence. But still, get a number of books and read them. Read those chapters because they're fun to read. I think at least I tried to make them fun to read. You can be the judge. But the summary of it is this: we kicked the British out of Egypt. It's a little more nuanced than that. It's not so simple as that. But the gist of it is we were not simply mediators between the Egyptians and the British. We were mediators with a desire to come out of the mediation with a strong friendship with the Egyptians, and so we forced the British out. Now, what happened though was the exact opposite of what was supposed to happen. By October ¡54, there's an agreement between the Egyptians and the British by which the British leave the Canal Zone, and within less than a year, Nasser has aligned considerably with the Soviet Union. Now the idea was we help him get rid of the British and then he becomes our friend, but it was sort of the opposite result we got. Now the first sign that there was really something serious, a serious problem in the U.S.-Egyptian relationship came in September 1955. With the Soviet arms deal. It's often known to history as the Czech arms deal, but everyone understood that Czechoslovakia wasn't making arms deals with Egypt without the support, urging, permission of the Soviets. So it was really a Soviet-Egyptian arms deal. And that deal introduced into the Middle East a quantity and a quality of weapons unlike anything that any of the other regional powers had. The Israelis regarded it as an existential threat. They calculated that it would take the Egyptians about a year to train on those weapons and to absorb them into the military. But then they thought after that they were in for big problems from the Egyptians. Now, you would have thought in a lot of history books, the Eisenhower administration gets a bad rap for being very unnuanced with regard to communism, that they regarded it as a black-white, good versus evil struggle with the Soviet Union, and that they would brook, they looked askance, or they were hostile to any third world power that aligned with the Soviet Union or had good relations with them, and so on. The evidence is actually, I think, especially with regard to Egypt, the exact opposite of that. The Egyptians aligned with the Soviet Union. They took these weapons, and we didn't punish them at all, and there was no move to punish them. Instead, we gave them a gift. Or Eisenhower gave them a gift, gave Nasser a gift. Right after the Soviet arms deal, our policy response was to put together a package of funding for Nasser for the Aswan High Dam. That was the flagship development project of the Egyptians that was going to bring hundreds of thousands of acres under cultivation and generate all kinds of new hydroelectric power by damming the Nile at Aswan. The United States worked together with the British and the World Bank to put together this package of funding. And again, that's because of this image that Eisenhower had of needing to make friends with the Arab nationalists and to tack away from the imperialists and the Zionists. But it was also because Eisenhower and Dulles and their top advisors didn't regard the Soviet arms deal as a slap at the United States. It was indirectly, but they didn't see that as Nasser's intention. Because Nasser explained to them, and they believed him, that I still believe that the natural place of Egypt is with the West. I do not regard this arms deal as anything but a kind of momentary detour to protect my flank. I love the United States, I love the West. The problem is Israel. The Israelis had carried out a border raid against Egypt in response to an attack, a terrorist attack by Egyptian military intelligence into Israel. The Israeli border raid killed 39 soldiers. This is the last day of February 1955, the beginning of March. And what Nasser told the Americans was that he'd been living a nightmare since that day, because the extremists in his regime would overthrow him if he didn't make some gesture against Israel. And the Soviets had exploited the current of opinion in the regime by offering these weapons, and so to protect his flank against the extremists, he had to take those weapons. And basically, he said, "Look, you've got a choice between me, the pragmatic, moderate, pro-Western leader, or the extremists in my regime, and well, who are you going to go with?" So Eisenhower bought it, Dulles bought it. But only for about 6 months. Then Eisenhower started to realize, as a result of a series of other events, which I won't bother going into with you, Eisenhower started to realize that Nasser was playing him, and that actually Nasser was aligning with the Soviet Union, and was not going to play the role that he had promised of helping to organize the Arab world against the Soviets. And so in March of *56, there's a massive change of policy, and the decision is made to put pressure on Egypt. And as part of that decision to put pressure on Egypt comes the decision to renege on the offer of funding for the Aswan High Dam. But when the Americans renege, Nasser does a clever maneuver, one of several very clever maneuvers that he carries out. The U.S. reneges on the funding, and he immediately turns around and he nationalizes the Suez Canal Company. Now, the reason this was so clever is that the Suez Canal Company was a joint Anglo-French enterprise, and it was a legacy of 19th century European colonialism. So ships that were going through the Suez Canal would pay their dues to the canal company in Paris, and the canal company would then forward a fraction of those dues, probably just about 2%, to the Egyptian government. So the Europeans were profiting enormously from the canal, and the Egyptians were getting very little. So as you can imagine, every Egyptian regarded this as a tremendous injustice, and they were thrilled at the fact that Nasser had nationalized it. Not just the Egyptians, but the entire Arab world was thrilled that he had done this. It was exhilarating. So what Nasser cleverly did is he got a slap from the Americans, and he turned what was a bilateral disagreement between Egypt and the United States into a contest between Egyptian and Arab nationalism on the one hand and European colonialism on the other. And what that did is it activated Eisenhower's traditional fear, the fear that he had come in with, of being on the side of European imperialism against nationalism. So even though he had decided that Nasser was no good, he had decided that, in his own words, Nasser was a blackmailer. Any concession we make to Nasser, he will pocket it and then demand more. But he still, despite that, this policy of pressure that he decided on was going to be pressure behind the scenes. He didn't want to get into a duel with Nasser in public, because Nasser, as he thought it, was just going to feed off the conflict of the West. Now, the British and the French had other ideas. They felt the pressure of Nasserism throughout the Arab world, and they were in danger of being thrown out of the region. So they wanted a military response to the nationalization of the canal. And they turned to the Americans and said, let's attack Nasser, and Eisenhower said, no way. And what Eisenhower did, again, this is I'm going to make some complex diplomacy very simple. Eisenhower played the British and the French, and he strung them out in meaningless diplomacy over the rest of the summer and into the fall. He promised the British, especially, that he would make Nasser disgorge the canal, but he realized that the only way to do that was to use military force, and he had no inclination to use military force. So they had meeting after meeting, conferences about the issue, all designed just to string the British and the French along, get them as far away from possible from the nationalization, so they no longer had a justification for attacking Egypt. At a certain point, the British and French realized that what the American game was, and they turned to the Israelis. The French had this idea, and the idea was that again, to make complex things a little simpler, the British, French, and the Israelis carried out simultaneous attacks on Egypt. The Israelis gave the Europeans a pretext for intervening, is what happened, but I won't go into the details with you here. The gist of it is, though, that they did this behind the back of Eisenhower, and they did it 1 week before the election in 1956, on the theory, no doubt, that Eisenhower wouldn't want to be in conflict with his allies and with Israel on during the election. It was a terrible error in judgment, and a terrible lack of appreciation of who Eisenhower was. He was infuriated by it. And he came down, to put it simply, on the side of Nasser against his traditional allies. Partly because of his fury of being stabbed in the back, but more importantly, again, that fear of being on the side of Zionism and imperialism against Arab nationalism. And so what he did is he went to the UN and got the General Assembly. Couldn't go to the Security Council because of the British and French had a veto power there. Went to the General Assembly and got a resolution calling for the belligerents the attackers to stop their attack immediately and withdraw unconditionally from Egypt. Now, then at the same time that was going on, Nasser did another clever maneuver. He filled boats with concrete and blocked the Suez Canal, so that the oil that goes through the Suez Canal couldn't get through to Europe. At the same time, he had his allies in Syria blow up the pipeline that went from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. So he cut off all the oil to Europe. When Anthony Eden, who's now the Prime Minister in Egypt, in Britain, turned to Eisenhower and asked for North American supplies of oil, Eisenhower said, no, You'll get no oil until you get out of Egypt immediately and unconditionally. Well, the financial markets in Britain got wind of the fact that there was no oil in Britain to fuel the economy, and the bottom dropped out of the pound. And Eden turned to Eisenhower and said, will you help me stabilize the markets at least? And Eisenhower said, no, not unless you get out of Egypt immediately and unconditionally. So Eisenhower brought the British economy to the brink of destruction. And of course, the British and the French had to withdraw. He then turned toward the Israelis. The Israelis held out against his pressure, Eisenhower's pressure, longer than the British and French. We didn't have the kind of economic leverage over the Israelis that we had over the British. So Ben-Gurion, the Prime Minister of Israel, was able to slow down the withdrawal and to negotiate. But in the end, Eisenhower, this is in March of '57 now, Eisenhower goes on national television and tells the American people that Israel is destroying the United Nations. Not just defying it, not just being difficult, but actually destroying it, because it was by refusing to heed its will. And so the supporters of Israel in Congress, they got cold feet. They didn't like the idea of going up against Eisenhower, who had just been reelected. And so they signaled to Ben-Gurion that they weren't going to help him. And so the Israelis also withdrew. They got some concessions from Eisenhower, and not completely meaningless concessions, but nothing like what they had hoped on the basis of the military victory that they had just won. The combined effect of all this was to hand Nasser an unbelievable victory over the British, French, and the Israelis. And he suddenly became, in the Arab world, 25 feet tall. He was, larger than life. Now, the theory was that by distancing ourselves from the Israelis and the Europeans, we were going to create a basis for cooperation with Arab nationalism, and that would keep the Arabs on the side of the West in the Cold War. But the result that Eisenhower got from supporting Nasser in the Suez Crisis was the exact opposite of the theory. What happened was he created a vacuum of power in the region by destroying the British position, especially. He destroyed the career of Anthony Eden. I mean, Eisenhower himself would have said Eden destroyed his own career. But as a result of the Suez Crisis, Anthony Eden was finished. He had to resign, had a nervous breakdown, basically, and had to resign. And the British were finished as a great power in the region. And there was then a wave of revolution in the Arab world, not unlike the revolutions that we had in 2011. All of the regimes that were set up by the British after World War I, you basically created the modern Middle Eastern system, came under enormous pressure from Nasser-inspired forces. This process of revolution, this wave of revolution, culminated in 1958 in the destruction of the regime in Iraq, which was the most pro-Western regime in the Cold War in the Middle East. And it's at that point that Eisenhower looked back at the wreckage and realized that he had destabilized the Middle East rather than stabilizing it. He got the exact opposite result of the one that he had expected. The Soviets had capitalized very cleverly on his policy. Once they realized his policy in the Suez Crisis, once they realized that the United States was actually sincere about slamming its own allies, they came out very cleverly with public threats to the British, French, and the Israelis to annihilate them with nuclear weapons. These were thinly veiled threats. In an age of nuclear-tipped missiles, it would be a shame if something bad were to happen to you. Sort of, dear Mr. Ben-Gurion, it's a nice little country you have there. It'd be a shame if it was destroyed by nuclear weapons. And Marshal Bulganin, the premier of the Soviet Union, he sent a letter to Eden, to Molay in France, and to Ben-Gurion, and made them public. The effect was that for the man on the street in the Arab world, it looked like Nasser had aligned with the Soviet Union to kick out the British and the French and the Israelis, and the role that the United States had played, which was almost all behind the scenes, seemed to be minimal. So we got no benefit from that, and Eisenhower realized it. You can see then when he goes into Lebanon in 1958, which is a direct response to the overthrow of the regime in Iraq, he has a completely different idea now of how the region works. And he's working closely with the British, who go into Jordan at the same time that we go into Lebanon, and he's starting to cooperate with the Israelis. He now sees Israel as an asset, not as a liability. And he realizes that in the Middle East you shouldn't get too sophisticated. You just have to support your friends and punish your enemies, even when your friends are doing things that you don't necessarily think are great ideas. So that's basically the story. I encourage you, as I say, to read it. More importantly, I encourage you to buy many copies. I hope I did the best I could to try to tell in the book, to write a book that somebody might want to read, because these days you have to compete with all of the Facebook and everything else. So I'll let you be the judge about that. I'll say now just a few words about the applicability to the present. In my mind, I started writing this before I saw the parallel, but as time was going on, I saw the parallel clearly. In my mind, there's a real parallel between President Obama's approach to the Middle East and President Eisenhower's. I think that the DNA, no two periods are the same. I don't want to suggest that it's identical. Obviously, there's no more Soviet Union and so on and so forth. But some of the same kind of impulses and analyses are present, and there's a family resemblance between the Obama foreign policy and the Eisenhower one. President Obama also distanced himself from Israel and thought that he would get a strategic benefit in the larger Muslim world from doing so. But more importantly, he reached out to the dominant or the leading anti-Western power in the region, in this case Iran, not Egypt, in an effort to show the Iranians that there's a pathway toward cooperation with the United States. Maybe we won't be allies, but at least we can find a modus vivendi, and he can demonstrate to them that we have a lot of shared interests, and that if they would reach out to us in a similar spirit, we could find a lot of ways to work together. I believe that was at the heart of the nuclear deal. I believe that that's at the heart of his Syria diplomacy, and as well as other policies, such as if you look at what's going on in Iraq today, we are providing the air power to Shiite militias on the ground, which are armed, trained, equipped, and to all intents and purposes led by the Iranians. So we are, without admitting it, we are the air force of the Iranian power on the ground in Iraq. My feeling is that policy, that approach, has resulted in something very similar to to the outcomes that Eisenhower witnessed in 1958, and that is that a vacuum has been created, and into that vacuum has moved now the Russians, just like the Soviets did in the 1950s. They've aligned with the Iranians, and we're now confronted with an Iranian-Russian alliance, certainly in Syria, but I think it stretches beyond. And the goal of that alliance, whatever they say publicly, is to undermine us and our allies. Now, they're a lot weaker than we are, which is a good thing. So they don't go after us directly; they go after us indirectly. But the effect is, in general terms, is the same. So that's the parallel I see. The book was reviewed favorably in the New York Times, also favorably in the Wall Street Journal. But I particularly liked the review in the New York Times, because the reviewer made the connection between the Obama administration and the Eisenhower administration exactly as I would have made it if I had been asked to write it. In fact, I said to my wife, it's not just that I couldn't have done it better, I couldn't have done it as well as he did. I mean, in a couple of short pages, he really made all of the major parallels. So if you're curious about that, have a look at what he wrote. That was David Frum in the New York Times. Okay, I'll stop there about the book, and just I'll make a few comments about the Trump administration, as where I see things heading, and what to watch for, and then we can turn it over to questions. It's too early, I think, it's too early to say exactly where the Trump administration is going to go in terms of specific policies. There are a lot of people out there talking about it, but I really think we have to wait and see until the president gets together with his top advisors and they start deciding on priorities. You know, it's very easy when you're a pundit like I am. You get your favorite issue and you can hammer away on your favorite issue, and you can always say, these guys don't understand anything. These are the real X, Y, and Z is really the important thing. But when you're actually in power, it's not this or that issue. It's the connections between all the issues and the sequencing that is the really tricky bit. It's deciding what's the priority, what's the secondary issue, how do they connect to each other, and so on. And I don't think there's nothing that we've heard so far will allow us to understand how they're understanding the interconnections between things. We have to wait and see. Nonetheless, having said all that, I see four kind of impulses that I think are pretty clear at this point. When you look at Trump's statements and then the picks that he's made for the major cabinet positions on national security, I see four very clear impulses, which are not all compatible with each other, or perfectly compatible with each other. Impulse number one is to move quickly to strike a blow against ISIS. And I think we can expect to see that early on. I haven't seen a plan yet, but I suspect that President Trump will call together his national security team in the early days and ask for a plan, within 30, 40 days for how to go after ISIS. And we'll see a considerable increase in resources against ISIS. The second impulse I see is a desire to push back against the Iranians, both around the region and the nuclear deal, which the administration has said time and time again is unacceptable. The trick there is how they're going to sequence these things. Are they going to, if you just look at the nuclear deal, are they going to? Is Trump going to call it null and void on day one? Or is he gonna wait some time and maybe put more pressure on the Iranians to live up to the terms of the deal, because right now they're not actually abiding by the terms of the deal perfectly. And secondly, what about their behavior in the region, their behavior in Syria, Iraq, and so forth? Is he going to shift there? And is he going to think that shifting against the Iranians in the region is more important than the nuclear deal, or does it take precedence over the nuclear deal, or the nuclear deal over everyone in the region? My own feeling is that they're probably going to be, this is my own feeling, I have no idea what they're actually going to do, but that they're going to be reluctant to call the nuclear deal null and void on day one, simply because it creates a lot of headaches very early on. Headaches including lots of difficulties with allies like the Germans, who like the deal a lot. That's one reason. The second reason is we don't have a lot of leverage over the Iranians right now. President Obama has ceded a lot of our leverage. So if you say it's null and void on day one, the Iranians say, okay, that's it. We're not bound by the deal anymore, and we're going to start enriching uranium at a faster pace. You're suddenly in, possibly a military confrontation with the Iranians, or they're going to have enough nuclear material to build a bomb. I think the inclination, given that President-elect Trump wrote The Art of the Deal, which emphasizes the importance of leverage in negotiations, I think that the first few months will probably be spent building up leverage over the Iranians before making any precipitous steps. That's just me talking, though. It's my speculation. The third area where impulse I see on the part of the Trump administration is to support Israel. I think that this is going to go down in history as the most pro-Israel administration in history. I don't see, with the possible exception of Rex Tillerson. And I only say that because I don't think we know what his views are on foreign policy. I don't see anyone in the administration who has any doubt or who suggests in any way that Israel is a liability to the United States. And I think in every other administration, Republican administration, there's always been a division of opinion about Israel. Now, in my book basically says, look, there's Eisenhower A and there's Eisenhower B. Eisenhower A came in believing that Israel was a liability. Eisenhower B thought it was an asset. And those two feelings, in the Republican Party, they remain all the way down through George W. Bush. But I think with each generation, the feeling that Israel is a liability gets less and less and less. It's really hard to make the argument today that, if we got it, if the Israelis make concessions to the Palestinians, it's going to help the situation in Syria, Iraq, or elsewhere. So I just see an inclination to be supportive of Israel. Then the fourth area I see is a desire, and you heard this in the press conference today, to work with Putin, particularly in fighting ISIS and in Syria. And this is the area where I see the most difficulty for the administration, particularly given its feelings about Iran. And that's because, number one, Russia is not fighting ISIS. It's using our current priority of fighting ISIS as an excuse to have, it pretends to be interested in that in order to get legitimacy from us, in order to do what it, to pursue its own interests in Syria. And also, it's in this alliance with Iran. So if you cut a deal with Russia in Syria, you're cutting a deal with Iran. That in Iran, Russia provides the air power, and the Iranians, through their proxies and increasingly with actual Iranians, are providing the ground troops. And they have exactly the same goal, which is to prop up the Assad regime. So if you're cutting a deal with Russia, you're cutting a deal with Iran. And if you push back against Iran in Syria, you're pushing back against Russia. Now, I can come up with ways in which you can reach out to Putin and put pressure on the Iranians at the same time, but this is a sophisticated policy, and it would still. It would still be a policy that would negotiate a contradiction. And so how they're going to negotiate that contradiction is really not clear to me yet. We just have to wait and see. For me, that's really the key question. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the really interesting questions strategically are where the different priorities intersect and how they intersect. I have no idea what they're going to do with that. But in the Middle East, there's no way, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this, there's no way to come up with a coherent policy that is perfectly without contradictions everywhere. You're gonna run into contradictions, and that's the whole game, is learning how to negotiate them. So I guess I'll stop there, and Ronan will ask some questions, I think.
Okay, excellent, great. Okay, my colleagues are going around the room. Just if you have any of those blue question cards that look like this, they're just collecting them, and please feel free to write them, and we'll bring them on up. Just while they're collecting some questions, just kind of in a broader sense, I think for a lot of the last number of American presidents, a lot of people say with regards to foreign policy, would particularly focus upon the Middle East, that George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, the father, was perhaps the most successful, or at least the most balanced with regards to how he approached the region. I think a lot of people perhaps accurately would say both Bush 43, the son, and Obama both came into office quite inexperienced with regards to foreign policy and perhaps not that knowledgeable. And that perhaps that was part of the reason for both of them having some significant issues with regards to the region. Are you concerned about that being a factor for Trump?
No, I'm not really, because I think that the team he's put together with General Mattis at Defense, Mike Pompeo the CIA and Rex Tillerson at State is just an outstanding team. I mean, I think he really has people with an enormous amount of experience and experience on multiple levels. I can't think of anything that would prepare somebody to be Secretary of State better than running ExxonMobil. And it just, you know, in terms of the kind of thought processes that you have to, running ExxonMobil is like running a state in a way. And you have operations, you have long-term interests, you have short-term interests, you have negotiations, you have to know. You know, I think about, I was an academic. I was at Princeton before I went to the White House. And when I got to the White House, you would, I mean, on paper you would have said, "Oh, this guy's got a lot of experience," because I was teaching U.S. Middle East relations at Princeton. I got to the White House, and the learning curve was like this. I actually doing it. I hate to say this because it, you know, but you know the old joke about those who do, those who can't teach. I actually felt like that because I was surprised at how little my academic knowledge helped me actually do the job. That when I was there, and you look, Rex Tillerson doesn't just, you know, he knows the leaders of these countries, and he knows the well, you know, which one's sons are addicted to drugs and which ones are fantastic, and he knows all of the he knows these places in 3 dimensions, and I think there's no substitute for that kind of experience.
Okay, and just referencing what you were talking about there at the end of your speech, you obviously have a extensive background of both the Defense Department and the NSC, where obviously the intelligence community was directly involved and working with all of you. What do you think is going to be the relationship? Obviously, it didn't get off to a good start between Trump and some of the intelligence services. I think at best, perhaps being dismissive of some of them. Where do you see that relationship, and are you concerned about it?
I don't know that that's what I'm seeing. I don't know that that's what I'm seeing at all. I mean, there are elements in, look, I haven't seen, to me it's very telling, I haven't seen anyone out of the intelligence communities complaining about Mike Pompeo, right? What I see is people that are people who are political appointees who are leaving the administration and looking for jobs in areas that aren't run by Republicans, who are leaking a lot of information, a lot of it faulty, fake information that the news media is latching onto. I think once you have the team in place and in charge, you're going to see a very different relationship between the intelligence community and the administration.
Okay, and a great question here from one of our members. Where does Saudi Arabia come to all of this, and Egypt? Perhaps if you could address both of them. I think they're referring to Saudi Arabia. Will they just sit on the sidelines for the next decade because of their own domestic challenges? I suppose it applies to both of them. But where do you see Saudi Arabia and Egypt with regards to the Trump administration?
I think we're going to see in the Trump administration what we saw in the Obama administration was a movement away from our traditional allies, not just Israel, but also the Saudis and also the Turks, and an outreach to the Iranians and the Russians in the Middle East. And we saw, in effect, it was never stated this way, but we saw the Obama administration recognize Syria as an Iranian and Russian sphere of interest. I think we're going to see a rebalancing, I guess I would call it, a movement of the United States back toward its traditional allies in an effort to compete with the Russians and the Iranians. Like I said, I don't know exactly what form that competition is going to come, in which it's going to come, but there's going to be a greater competition. Another thing that you've seen in reaction to the Obama administration's pivot, if you look at this, say, this triangle between Turkey, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, there has been improved relations on each side of that triangle, so that Saudi-Turkish relations have improved, Turkish-Israeli relations have improved, and Israeli-Saudi relations have improved. That, I think, is the kind of basis on which the Trump administration is going to work through the Middle East. Now, that's not a perfect structure, because there are enough differences between, political and demographic and religious differences between the Saudis, Turks, and the Israelis to make it hard for them to work as a bloc. But all of them recognize that the United States, all of them are willing to support the hegemony of the United States in the region. And all of them are very concerned in one way or another with the rise of Iran and Russia. So I think the Saudis are going to play a very supportive role of this, what I suspect will be the new orientation of the Trump administration, which is an old orientation.
I'm just going to combine 2 or 3 questions that reference it. Reference the OPEC, and obviously a region much like ourselves here in Texas, deeply impacted by the price of oil and energy markets. I know you're not an energy specialist, but just would you be able to comment on what do you think fluctuations in the price of oil already have had big impacts there? What could happen, say, in the next few years?
You know what? I'm gonna actually dodge that one, just because I think I would just be making stuff up, and there'd be a lot of people in the audience who would say, you know what, he's just making that up. So that's great. I really appreciate your candor.
A few questions here related to Israel. One of the questions it says basically, what's your perspective on any form of two-state solution, or what might happen with Israel and Palestine?
I don't think there's any chance of a two-state solution in the short term. I think that when I was in the Bush administration, I was in the White House from 2005 to 7. And I wrote reams and reams and reams of memos. I don't know how high, saying there's no there, because Condoleezza Rice was very interested in pursuing the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and that her desire culminated in the Annapolis conference at the end of the administration. And she, from the moment she got into the State Department, that's what she wanted to do, but especially after the 2006 war with Israel. And there's a ton of memos with my name on it saying, this is not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. This isn't a little problem that, some elbow grease from the Americans is going to make go away. On all the major issues, the two parties are extremely far apart. We get confused, diplomats get confused because especially when they're dealing with the United States, we're the most powerful country on earth. So if we turn to any two powers and we say, we want to negotiate with you, they don't say get lost most of the time. They say, oh yes, we want to negotiate too. And then they take a position, what the Israelis and the Palestinians do is neither one of them wants to be blamed by the United States for the failure of the process. So they sit down at the table and they take positions. And then the American diplomats look at those positions and they say, wow, look, there's only this little bit of distance. But that little bit of distance is actually an enormous amount of distance. It's been made to look like less distance because of the positions the diplomats are taking up. But it's actually huge. And if you talk to the leaders on either side, you realize how far they are apart on all the major issues, on Jerusalem, on the borders, on the settlements, on the right of return, all this stuff. It's huge. So and when you look at the position of Abu Mazen doesn't have any inclination himself to cut a deal, and then he's got the problem of Hamas and Gaza and so on. Not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And I can see you want to get on to another one. I got a couple more things. You opened up a can of worms here. It's not going to happen, and it's not as strategically important as people believe it is. The problem is that there's an enormous amount of cultural, religious, and American domestic political valence around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I was in the last round of elections. I advised a candidate in the election who didn't have a lot of foreign policy experience at first, but he had his line on the Israel question he had down, and that's the way it is. If you're an American politician, before you ever talk about foreign policy in any way, you already have a position on Israel. That leads you to start to believe, and you can see this in the Eisenhower administration of all these guys, that to start to believe that Israel is the center of the region. Right? And that's the fulcrum, because that's what you're talking about in domestic politics all the time. It's a big mistake. It isn't the fulcrum of the region at all. So it's not as strategically important, but even more importantly, there's no there. So even if the Trump administration decides that it wants to push for negotiations, nothing's going to happen. And we've already seen that. Look how much resources Obama put into this, and it went nowhere. Having said all that, I don't think there's an answer other than the two-state solution. So what we should do is, there's no answer, but there is an answer. I mean, there's a theoretical answer. There's no other theoretical answer. So what we need to do is just sort of do no harm, you know, and make sure that we don't do anything to upset things. And I don't think that's so hard.
Okay, and I'm afraid just for the sake of time, we'll have to make this the last question. I'm just going to, again, kind of...
I filibustered you on the last one.
It's okay. Maybe combine 2 or 3 questions and their key comments from it. You know, a lot of people would say that, you know, Eisenhower started with some of the biggest mistakes of foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, Middle East, and we've made a lot of significant mistakes there in the 60, 70 years since then. Obviously, with the decline of importance with, oil basically being produced in other parts of the world, the U.S. becoming more energy independent. I know you're a Middle East analyst and policy specialist, but how do you explain to the American public why we should continue a strong focus on Middle East?
Well, I think the experience of the Obama administration is the best case. My reading of President Obama is that he really wanted to get the United States out of the Middle East as much as possible. And I don't know if you all read Jeffrey Goldberg's article in The Atlantic in April, The Obama Doctrine. Goldberg basically says, President Obama just doesn't think the Middle East matters that much. And I agree with that. That's what he thinks. And he pulled out of Iraq, and he thought that he would go down in history as the guy who pulled us out of Iraq. But look, we're back in Iraq. Right? He said he didn't want to have military operations in Syria. I don't know if you read the paper the other day. We just carried out a special operations raid in Syria. Right? We're carrying out bombing raids in Syria after President Obama did everything he could to make sure that we didn't get sucked into Syria. We were going to cauterize, or whatever they were using, the Syrian conflict and contain it. And we got hundreds of thousands, millions actually, of displaced people, many of whom have made their way into Europe and created all kinds of tensions in Europe, which has worked to the disadvantage of the NATO alliance with regard to Russia, and created all kinds of needless conflicts inside Europe that are difficult for us now. So the fact of the matter is, it's like what Trotsky said about war. You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. You may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you. And we can say we're going to pick up and leave, but it's going to follow us. So better to take care of the problem over there. Better to have a sane strategy to take care of the worst pathologies in the region. The other thing is that President Obama thought that if he created a space for the Russians and the Iranians, and this is what happens. The minute when we pull out, somebody else is going to go in, right? And the Russians and the Iranians went in, and they're carrying out policies. They're using it as a base, the Middle East as a base, to undermine our position around the world. So I don't think we have any choice. We're the greatest power on earth. We have to be involved in every part of the world.
Okay. All right. Well, again, want to thank you all for coming, and definitely recommend buying a great copy of this excellent book, Ike Campbell. And thank you very much, Mike Doran. Thank you.
Thank you.